Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Family Treehouse, a podcast series brought to you by Storied, where I chat with people that have a passion for genealogy, storytelling, or both. I am your host, Heather Haunert, and today I am very excited to have a special guest with us, Robin Fivush. She is the developmental psychologist at Emory University, researching memory and family storytelling. She also writes a blog for Psychology Today called The Stories of Our Lives. Welcome, Robin, to the show.
Thanks, Heather. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Super excited to chat with you today and all about the importance of sharing those family stories. So, Robin, why don't you start by just kind of giving us a background about you and how you got started in this research with family storytelling and memory and just how you got started in the whole field.
Sure. I started many years ago. I kind of don't even want to tell you how many years ago. And I was really interested in how very young children come to understand their experiences and make sense of the world. So I started just by, going into homes and asking families to just, behave as they naturally would. And I was interested in the interaction between parents and toddlers around how they essentially made meaning out of everyday things in the world.
Mhm.
And it didn't take long for me to realize that what families do is they talk about what happened. It could be what happened earlier that day, it could be what happened at grandma's last weekend, or it could be, even with toddlers, things that happened well before they were born
Yeah.
that happened in the family. So I became really intrigued in how families talk about past experiences. And over the years, my colleagues, my students, and I have studied hundreds of families with children ranging from 18 months, 2 years, 3 years, up through adolescence,
Okay.
visiting them in their homes or asking them explicitly to tell us family stories. So some of our work is just spontaneous family interaction, and some of it is really targeted toward tell us the stories you know about. Tell us
Mhm.
stories you know about your mom when she was growing up as she was a teenager. Tell us stories you know about your grandparents. So through all of those different avenues, we've really discovered the power of these family stories, particularly in young people's lives. That's been my focus, although it's also other research that has really shown how powerful this is for the older generation telling the stories as well.
Okay.
But I think what's really important to understand is that family stories are really of all kinds of different things. They may be your own personal story that you're sharing with your family members. It could be something exciting that happened at lunch that day. Then there's the shared family stories, things we all did together. When we went to the beach last summer, or when we went to see that funny movie we all loved. And then there's the family history stories, the stories of before the children were born, what happened when the parents were growing up, grandparents, etc. All of those kinds of stories, those my own stories about my life, shared family stories, family history stories, they just are completely interweaved when we talk about ourselves. They're not distinct. They just blend into each other and they all inform each other. And why that's really important is because when I'm telling my own personal story, it's seeped in the stories of my parents, my grandparents, my family. All of that informs the very core of who I am.
Yeah. I love the idea of the different types of stories that you talked about because we do all have those. How why do you think it's so important? I want to talk a minute for kind of that generational idea and so talking about having stories that
Mhm.
the younger children are asking the grandparents. Why do you think that is so important?
There are so many reasons why that's important. One is that you have to think about where these young people are in their lives. They are just starting to have the world open up to them. Perhaps, they're going off to high school or going off to college, or going off to a first job, having a first romantic relationship. The world is new and even more so as we've learned over the last few years, uncertain and anxiety provoking. So, how do we make sense of all of that? And we make sense of that through stories, through the experiences of others who are like us. Our families, our parents and grandparents, are our very strong identification figures. These are people that we feel we're like them, we're similar to them, that they have some meaning for our own personal sense of identity. So when they talk about their experiences, I can take that as ways of understanding how the world works. Oh, this is how my mother made sense of this. This is how my grandfather made sense of this. It gives adolescents and young adults models of how to be in the world, of how the world works. So parents often express surprise when we tell them the kinds of stories that their adolescents and young adults are telling us. Parents think, oh, I tell these stories, but my kid is just rolling their eyes and not paying attention. But in fact, we've now found in studies with hundreds of adolescents and young adults that over 95% of them can easily tell us a story that they know, or multiple stories that they know about their mom or their dad when their mom was a teenager, when their grandmother was growing up. They know these stories, they're listening. And they can also tell us why they think their parent or grandparent told us these stories. And they tell us things like, well, she told me that because she knew that I was going through something similar. So to help me learn more about myself, or to help me learn about how the world works, to help me learn a lesson about morals and values, or to help me learn about who she is as a person. And these kids, these adolescents and young adults who know these stories and can talk about why these stories are important to them, they actually show much higher levels of well being. They show higher self esteem, they show less anxiety, they show fewer internalizing problems, things like withdrawal, depression, fewer externalizing problems, problems with anger and aggression. They show a higher sense of self competence, self assurance, and they show a higher sense of meaning and purpose in life. So these stories really matter for them in making sense of who they are in the world and how the world works.
Those are some very powerful numbers that you have there. And I just think self-affirming for parents and grandparents, telling these stories that the kids are listening, and how important they are to them. That's very powerful. Robin, talk about, I think we all have these types of experiences. Talk a little bit about what are some kind of considerations and sensitivities to keep in mind when you're sharing, are of a sensitive nature or some challenging stories from your family. Talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. This is really something that parents need to think about carefully in many ways. I mean, just to backtrack a little bit, telling positive stories, stories of fun times are very important. It bonds the family, laughing together, having good times together, gives you a real sense of a positive shared history that keeps the family close knit and really a sense of belonging. But it's those difficult stories, those challenging stories, those stories that might be a little darker and more sensitive, that really prove to be critically important. Those are the stories that challenge who we are in the world and how we want to or should behave, how we want to or should react. How do we get through difficult and challenging things? But you do have to be careful in how you tell these stories. One, they have to be developmentally appropriate. So certain stories just don't get shared with 4 and 5 year olds. I
Right.
think parents mostly understand that. But what about as children get into adolescence and they're starting to engage in riskier behaviors, they're out in the world? To what extent do you share your own stories of experiences that perhaps were a little bit more difficult and challenging? What we find in our research is that parents who tell these kinds of stories, stories of challenge and personal tumult and difficulty, when they show some of that vulnerability to their kids, particularly when it is resolved in a positive way. It's very positive for adolescents and young adults. The problem is that not all experiences can be positively resolved. Some things are just difficult and they just remain difficult. So I think about one of my own family stories. My grandparents were immigrants, were Eastern European immigrants, and they had a young child during the Depression. And they just talk about how hard it was. And how hard it was to have a roof over their head and food on the table. And ultimately the economy got better, but there was no real redemptive or positive resolution to that. It was just hard. But the moral of the story was we stuck together, we lived through it, we overcame, we're still together, we're still a family. So the ultimate message to me as a teenager and a young adult had been, we can get through things if we stick together, if we work together. So even when there isn't a positive resolution, there can be a positive message or moral in those stories.
I think that's important because I think a lot of times parents and grandparents don't want to share those types of stories. So I think to hear that, there is a positive for telling those stories is important. Great example. So Robin, tell me, what are some, what types of advice or tips or tricks do you have for our audience? I think one thing that people really get stuck on is, what do I ask? So what would you say to that question?
I think there's two sides to that. What do I ask? But also, what do I tell and how do I tell it? And I think families often have this idea that, oh, we have to sit down and tell these big family stories and everybody has to be listening and, I don't know, taking notes or something. And the answer to that is actually stories are just the world we live in. Stories come up all the time in conversation. As I said, sometimes it's just what happened at lunch that day, or that reminds me of our beach vacation, or it can come into these more, elaborated family stories of what happened when your parents were growing up. But these stories are often told in bits and pieces throughout family life. Many of the stories that we know about our families were never told as a formal story. They were just told in bits and pieces throughout the years. Maybe as you're preparing the turkey for Thanksgiving, you get a piece of a story about your grandmother's early Thanksgiving experiences. And then the next year, during the same preparation, you get a different piece of the story. Stories can come in bits and pieces. That's okay. It's really the idea that you're sharing part of yourself and part of your experience. But then there are those very emblematic family stories, often told at celebrations like Thanksgiving and holidays and birthdays. The story that is always told, big story, in the same way by, crazy Uncle Joe, who has to tell the story every year the same way. So all of those stories are important and they play different roles. The emblematic stories become stories that symbolize the family in certain ways, but they also become touch points for the family. The family can kind of say, oh, crazy Uncle Joe, always telling that story. But the bits and pieces stories, the stories that are pieced together in a little bit of conversation here and a little bit of conversation there, something comes up over the dinner table while you're watching TV, in the car, they still give a sense to those who are part of that storytelling community, that family, of who we are, what's important to us. How do we share our sense of who we are as individuals and as a family? I think parents, the biggest message that I could give to parents and grandparents in terms of telling is, don't worry about having the stage, so to speak. Just talk. Stories are going to come out and stories will be told. In terms of asking, I do think it's important, particularly with some older generation grandparents or perhaps even great grandparents for some of the teenagers in our studies, they often don't talk about their history for reasons that you mentioned, that they had difficult experiences. They don't think that their grandchild is ready to hear it. I think that in those cases, it is important to give the message that I want to hear these stories. These stories are important to me. How do you ask? I do think that is an individual decision about whether you want to do a formal family history, an oral history or a recorded history. And there are lots of resources for doing that. Or if you just want to do it for yourself and just sit down and listen to these stories.
Robin, talk about, I'm curious. I recently had a story in my family that came up. My poor brother, I knocked his teeth out when he was very little. It was an accident. But talk about how important or not important is it to have different variations of a story. So in that instance, I had my version. And
Mhm.
when I told my mom, she had her version and my brother had his version. So how important is it to have those different variations of a story?
That's a great question because particularly siblings often have different versions of
Yeah.
stories. Um, Memory is not pristine. Memory is not 100% accurate. Memory is the sense we make out of our experiences and then recall and retell. So there's always some perspective in every memory, and that we all see it in our own way. It doesn't make the memory inaccurate, it doesn't make the memory wrong.
Mhm,
It just makes the memory a little bit nuanced or a little bit different.
mhm.
I think that many, many family stories come with many, many different perspectives.
Yeah.
What we see in our families that we work with in our research is that the families that accept and validate those multiple perspectives have children who are doing better on the measures I mentioned earlier: self esteem, sense of mastery, sense of self competence. When a story is imposed and kind of told, no, you don't understand what happened, it was really this way, and you're just wrong about that, that that actually leads to some issues with a sense of not quite feeling comfortable in uh, in yourself. I, how
Mhm.
could I be wrong about what I remember? How
Yeah.
could I be so wrong in what I think happened? So it leads to a sense of insecurity and loss of kind of a sense of self competence.
Yeah.
So I think there are ways of saying, I get it, you see it that way. It's not the way I see it, but I get it that you see it that way. Sometimes talking it through, you can come to a compromise. Sometimes you just have to agree to disagree.
Yeah, me too. Oh.
It's no different with spouses, by the way. You
Yeah,
know,
true. Yeah, very, very true. Very true. Right. Well, Robin, it has been a pleasure chatting with you today. I think having your perspective on the podcast has been important. And I think it's just another way for people to think about how storytelling fits into their family narrative. And I think that's crucial. So thank you for joining us. I appreciate your expertise and passion, and I am honored that you spent time with me today.
well, thank you. I enjoyed talking with you, and I always love to talk about family stories anytime.
It makes it fun when we enjoy it, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Until next time, friends, embrace the power of your family's untold tales and embark on a journey of discovery. Let the ink flow and the words dance as you weave together the threads of your ancestors' lives. Start writing your family stories today and let their voices echo through the generations to come at storied.com. And that brings us to the end of this episode of the Family Treehouse, where we celebrate the power of storytelling and preserving our family legacies. Storied is more than just a platform for sharing stories. Dive into those historical records and newspapers, discovering the hidden gems that bring your ancestors to life. Add branches to your family tree, connecting the dots between generations. Thank you for joining us on this storytelling journey. Your stories matter, and through Storied, they have the power to resonate across time and touch the hearts of generations to come. Keep uncovering your family's history and keep the spirit of storytelling alive with Storied.